Harrison and the ballerinas have to cover up their attractiveness. How did Vonnegut's take on beauty and fairness compare/contrast with modern beauty movements such as body positivity and body neutrality? Vonnegut's portrayal of equality in the story, especially in the provided examples, heavily contrasts with today's equality movements, to the point of being a near polar opposite of today's movements. An example of this, such as the examples you provided, can be summarized by Vonnegut's portrayal of equality being cutting every person down to the same level, whereas today we, in the pursuit of equality, choose to elevate every person to the same level. I can safely assume that this contrast is the result of the time the story had been written, as well as the years of experience lived by Vonnegut before the writing of the story, playing their influence over the writer during the time of the story. In the right wing, and all across America, even in educational institutions, in the past and still today, it is a commonly referenced falsehood that socialism/communism, they are different, is a cap, not a baseline, when it is in fact the opposite. In the story, equality is treated like a cap. Everybody is cut down to the same point, whereas today we try to elevate everybody to the same point, a baseline of sorts. I believe that the past, and not coincidentally the modern conception of what socialism/communism is, played a heavy influence on Vonnegut's writing of the story. Personally, I feel the story is incredibly flawed. The entire story focuses on some falsehood of how equality means cutting everybody down to the same point instead of uplifting everybody to the same baseline. Simply put, cutting everybody down to the same size is not equality. That is a power grab. I find it I find it absurd to believe that even in a fictional future 120 years after the writing of the story, we would be cutting people down instead of uplifting them to the same point. Why, of all things, would we be doing that? At some point, it would just be cheaper and much easier to uplift everybody to the same point. Why did the 212th, 213th, and 214th Amendments focus on cutting everybody down to the same size instead of uplifting them to the same point? The ideas postulated by the story directly skip over multiple gaping holes in the themes of the plot, too. With everybody being supposed with everybody supposed to be equal by destruction, as I'm going to term it, what does this mean for people with chronic or genetic diseases or other conditions that cannot be treated? Does this mean that if cancer still exists, which I'm sure it does, as cancer is going to be one other hell of a thing to just simply kill, does this mean that everybody has to either have cancer or, if not, have perpetual cancer-like symptoms? That opens the floodgates to even more questions. Does this mean that because people still presumably die, everybody has to be executed? If so, when? If somebody gets killed in their 40s, say a car accident or something, does that mean that now every single person has to be executed at the exact age to the day that person was when they died? Or what about infant deaths? If an infant dies for some reason, say they got some horrible respiratory disease, it sounds familiar, does that mean that all people have to be executed as an infant? Or what about stillbirths? Does that mean that every child now has to be immediately killed? In all three of these cases, what if you're above 40 in the case of the first example I gave, and that scenario happens? Does the government just get to give you a free pass, even though that breaks directly all of the amendments mentioned? Or do they just go something like, well, fuck it, your time's up, bub. Break in your door with the SWAT team. And the same if you're in your, say, 20s and an infant dies. Or, in the case of a third example, what if, well, you're alive at all and a stillbirth happens? Wh- which of those happens to you? Speaking of the first example, being chronic or genetic diseases and whatnot, does this mean that if everybody is cut down to the same point, do we all have weakened immune systems? Well, if so, that makes the above so much more possible, and the repercussions that much harder to avoid. Do you see what I mean when I say that it's just easier to uplift everybody? Like, this story, this is not equality. This is so far from equality. The holes in the story and its themes make a 300 cubic meter block of pure Swiss cheese look structurally sound. This story makes quicksand look like solid ground to stand on. And the best part, anti-socialists still Despite all the problems and gaping holes with the story, use the story as an example of why socialism and leftism doesn't work. You can't make this stuff up. None of this makes sense. What is any of this? None of the story as a commentary or criticism on equality, leftism, and progressivism holds up under any scrutiny. You look at the story's message too hard and it breaks. You look at the story just a little bit too hard and it immediately starts to crumble to the ground. This story tries to make some point of this is what equality means. This is what equality will do to us. But this isn't equality. This is nothing even remotely close to equality. And nobody is even remotely trying to state that this is the kind of equality that we should be pursuing. In classic conservative slash general right wing fashion, the story is arguing against an opponent in an argument that does not exist. In classic right wing fashion, the main theme of the story, were a person having an argument, would be arguing with, hell, yelling at the sky. Arguing with and yelling at absolutely nothing. The story is arguing against something that has never existed. The story is trying to combat a viewpoint that never was. Vonnegut's theme that he intends you to walk away with is nothing short of, as Dan Zierl, member of the band Architects and writer of the song Deepfake, would say, fighting with a shadow in the dark. Nothing. It's fighting nothing.